We begin this news hour in Indonesia, where at least 162 people have been killed and hundreds more have been left injured after a magnitude 5.6 earthquake hit the country's main island of Java. The quake triggered a landslide and collapsed buildings in Cianjur, where most of the deaths were reported, but also shook tower blocks in the capital, Jakarta, for 3 terrifying minutes as people rushed onto the streets. Arise chief correspondent John Cookson reports.
The epicenter of the earthquake was on land at Cianjur, about 75 kilometers southeast of the capital, Jakarta. The West Java town was the worst hit by the tremor, which was 10 kilometers below the earth. 700 people were injured and several dozens were killed here. Much livestock has been lost and thousands of homes have been damaged, many beyond repair. Several landslides were reported around Cianjur. Dozens of public buildings were damaged, including an Islamic boarding school, a hospital, and other public structures. Indonesia, a country of more than 270 million people, is frequently struck by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions and tsunamis because of its location on the so-called Pacific Ring of Fire. The earthquake was felt in the capital, Jakarta, where residents were evacuated from high-rise office blocks and homes. This office worker said, "I was working as normal doing reports in the office. Then it was as if someone had pushed me over," she said. And this man said, "We're used to earthquakes in Jakarta, but people were so nervous, so we also panicked." A massive rescue operation gets underway to find the missing. The big worry now is a wave of aftershocks. John Cookson, Arise News.
Now, Russian forces in southern Ukraine have stepped up shelling of the recently liberated Kherson region. A senior Ukrainian official said the emergency services were searching for possible victims in the rubble of a residential building. The city of Kherson remains largely without power or water following the withdrawal of Russian troops 10 days ago. Meanwhile, UN inspectors are due to go into Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant to assess how serious the damage is from shelling over the weekend. Experts have warned that the reactors could overheat if a direct hit were to damage their cooling system. Russia and Ukraine have accused each other of carrying out explosions at the site of Europe's biggest nuclear power plant. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, has condemned the latest bombardment as another close call. Well, for more on the war in Ukraine, let's speak to Arise chief correspondent John Cookson, who is monitoring developments from London. Good to see you, John. So let's start with Zaporizhzhia. Everyone agrees that shelling there represents incredible dangers. But who is doing the shelling of that nuclear power plant? That's not clear. Ukraine says it's Russia. Russia says it's Ukraine. But whoever is doing it is playing with fire, aren't they? What's the latest that we know?
Charles, good to see you. Well, the plant was built as long ago as 1985. It's Europe's biggest nuclear power plant. It was, in pre-war times, supplying 25% of Ukraine's total electricity. Now that's completely out of action, having a huge impact on Ukraine's electricity supplies. Who's shelling? Who knows? The Russians, as you say, are blaming the Ukrainians blame the Russians. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and both sides are probably shelling somewhere in the area. Just to remind viewers that the nuclear power plant is manned by Ukrainians, but in territory controlled by the Russians, which makes things extremely difficult indeed. You're absolutely right. I mean, a shell hitting the reactor, which has been the 6 reactors have been shut down, in fact, for some months now, could release radioactive waste into the atmosphere, as could a direct hit on a storage area where spent fuel rods are kept, and you know, the possibility of this kind of nuclear accident is so real, and the fact that this is in the middle of a war zone, just, you know, there go, by the grace of God go I. Anything could happen at any time. The IAEA inspectors will get a chance to have a look to find out what's going on. They're unlikely, Charles, to apportion blame to either side. They for sure will want to stay neutral in this to ensure that they get access to the plant in the coming weeks as the war drags on. But it's certainly a serious situation at the moment.
Well, it certainly sounds like it, John. And of course, Ukraine was the country that suffered that Chernobyl nuclear disaster. I suppose that's why there are fears that something similar could happen in Zaporizhia. So should people on the European continent be very worried about all this shelling?
Well, just to soften things slightly, I pointed out the dangers. I would also say that when the plant was built all those years ago, it was built to sustain a civilian aircraft crashing accidentally into the site. So, you know, the concrete and the metalwork around the main buildings is very, very sound indeed. But the danger doesn't come from that specifically, from a direct hit. It's also whether the electricity supply is stopped to the cooling process, because if the reactors overheat or the spent fuel rods overheat, again, that could cause a mini explosion and for radiation to transmit into the atmosphere. In Europe, should they be worried? Frankly, no, because the drift of the winds in the region are from west to east, ironically, pushing the weather systems and the clouds that would carry any radioactive waste towards Russian-held territory. So that's another anomaly here. But no, generally speaking, European countries shouldn't be worried about fallout from Zaporizhia if the worst happened.
Well, let's turn away from Zaporizhia, John, and to Kherson, the city and the area. Kherson, of course, spared from the worst of the shelling and airstrikes because it was occupied by the Russians. But now that they've withdrawn, there's been a huge increase in targeted shelling of the city. What are you hearing about that?
Well, it shouldn't surprise anyone. The Russians do this, do they not? Mariupol, for example, being an example of how they try to just simply destroy cities if they can, albeit in this case from across the Dnipro River. Shells are falling, you're absolutely right, hitting residential areas and power plants and other infrastructure in the city. However, a lot of civilians have been evacuated, and I'm hearing tonight that not only are citizens of that city being evacuated, 30,000 at least so far. Even further north in Mykolaiv, people are being evacuated from there because of this fear of Russia's campaign to lay waste to the region. And already things are very, very difficult. The first snows have fallen. Temperatures there, certainly in the -1, -2 tonight, and civilians having a very tough time of things. But a big evacuation program is underway, and the Ukrainians will ensure, I'm sure, that as many people as possible will be evacuated to other cities in the area. For example, Odessa or even further north to central Ukraine. So a big evacuation process underway at the moment.
And John, you probably know this, but in the build-up to the World Cup that's currently going on, FIFA boss Gianni Infantino issued a plea for a ceasefire in the war in Ukraine for the duration of the World Cup, calling for all sides to use the tournament as a positive trigger to work towards a resolution. But clearly that plea has fallen on deaf ears.
Wouldn't that be wonderful, Charles? Because as we've spoken in the past, over the last few weeks, I've always said to you that the goal has to be, first of all, a ceasefire, because in that kind of atmosphere, it could possibly lead to negotiations towards some kind of settlement of this dreadful war. But being practical here, it's not going to happen at the moment, although the winter months will slow things down a little bit. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying today that the West stands firmly still behind Ukraine, and that the West is ready to stay the course with Ukraine, and NATO also wants to speed up the accession to NATO of Finland and Sweden. So there's no sign, you look for straws in the wind on the international scene that things might be coming to some kind of negotiated settlement or a ceasefire, but there's just absolutely nothing at the moment.
John, thanks very much indeed for bringing us up to date with what's happening in Ukraine, and also, of course, for your special report at the outset on that earthquake in Indonesia. John Cookson is Arise chief correspondent.